In 1995, inside a boardroom far from the old production lines of Chicago, an era of American electronics ended. Zenith Electronics, a company that had defined the sound of the American living room, surrendered its independence. Staggering under years of financial losses and global price pressure, the last remaining American-owned television and home audio manufacturer sold a controlling stake to LG Electronics of South Korea. The manufacturing facilities in Illinois, where generations of workers had assembled heavy wooden cabinets and wired speaker crossovers, faced an unfamiliar future. The famous lightning bolt badge was now an asset in a foreign portfolio. The surrender made no sense to anyone who remembered the middle of the 20th century. Decades earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. Zenith was not just a manufacturer, it was an American institution. It was the company that stamped, "The quality goes in before the name goes on," across massive stereo consoles. It was the engineering force that placed the Zenith Allegro speaker system, a ported speaker design that used trapped air to produce deep bass without requiring massive amplifier power, into millions of suburban living rooms, making serious stereo sound accessible without the crushing expense of audiophile equipment. But the real story of Zenith in America is not merely the sale of a corporate trademark. It is the story of domestic labor costs colliding with global supply chains. It is the story of a market that once valued heavy, repairable wooden audio furniture and the ruthless transition toward lighter, cheaper imports. It is the story of the American listening room, how it was built, how it was furnished, and what happened when listeners decided that low prices were worth more than the wood, the wire, and the origin. Every week we tell the stories of the American speakers, audio brands, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music, movies, and memory, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, inside a small amateur radio workshop in Chicago, Illinois, in 1918. The story begins in Chicago, Illinois, in 1918. Two amateur radio enthusiasts, Carl Hassel and Ralph Matthews, began building rudimentary radio sets on a kitchen table. They operated a small broadcasting operation under the amateur call sign 9ZN. Soon, they were joined by a charismatic former naval officer named Eugene F. McDonald, Jr., a man who understood that the future of sound and communication could not remain a mere hobby for tinkerers. They formally organized the Chicago Radio Laboratory, and shortly after, they adopted a commercial trademark derived directly from that original call sign, ZNeth. The Zenith brand was born. Before Zenith's massive consumer expansion, American sound reproduction was fractured, unreliable, and visually unappealing. In the 1920s and 1930s, rural and suburban American families were isolated from national culture. An audio receiver was not a polished piece of furniture. It was typically a complex, intimidating tangle of exposed wires, glowing vacuum tubes, and crude dials, often prone to static and mechanical failure. If a family in the American Midwest wanted to hear a live radio broadcast from a distant city, they needed a machine that did not just capture a weak signal, but one that could survive the dust and temperature shifts of a living room. American listeners lacked an appliance that treated sound reproduction as both a serious science and an elegant domestic centerpiece. McDonald understood the American middle-class buyer perfectly. He mandated a manufacturing philosophy that would define the company for the rest of the 20th century. Zenith would not compete on the lowest possible price. It would compete on absolute reliability and premium craftsmanship. This operational doctrine gave rise to the corporate motto that would eventually be stamped on millions of owner manuals, sales brochures, and television screens across the country. The quality goes in before the name goes on. To guarantee this, Zenith built their own internal components, tested their own complex circuits, and housed their electronics in heavy, genuine wood cabinets assembled by American workers. By the middle of the 20th century, the Zenith Empire was operating massive production facilities, including the famous Dickens Avenue plant in Chicago, employing thousands of domestic workers. By the 1950s and 1960s, the American living room had fundamentally changed. The radio was no longer the sole center of family entertainment. The television had arrived, and alongside it, the demand for high-fidelity audio, hi-fi, meaning sound reproduction that tries to stay faithful to the original recording. Zenith applied its vast manufacturing power to dominate the stereo console market. These were massive, integrated wooden units, sometimes measuring over 6 feet across, containing a turntable, a stereo receiver, and a pair of built-in speaker systems, all hidden behind acoustic cloth grills. The Zenith stereo console quickly became an ultimate American status symbol. In the early 1960s, a premium Zenith solid-state stereo console could cost between $300 and $500, an enormous household investment at a time when the average American weekly wage was roughly $90. But families paid the premium because Zenith did not sell these units through faceless mail-order catalogs. They sold them through a vast, trusted, and highly localized dealer network. Zenith franchised local appliance stores, television repair shops, and dedicated electronics showrooms across all 50 states. A buyer in Ohio or California did not order a Zenith blind. They walked into a local showroom, touched the real walnut veneer, a thin layer of attractive wood used on the outside of a speaker cabinet, and listened to a physical demonstration by a neighborhood salesman they knew by name. But as the 1960s turned into the 1970s, the American audio market fractured once again. The massive, immovable console was no longer the only way to hear music. Younger listeners, college students, and a new generation of serious audiophiles were rapidly moving toward component audio, separate receivers, standalone turntables, and distinct pairs of bookshelf speakers. Acoustic suspension speakers, a sealed box design where the air inside the cabinet acts like a spring to control the woofer, were pouring out of New England factories from companies like Acoustic Research and KLH. These sealed boxes produced excellent, accurate bass, but they were terribly inefficient, requiring massive, expensive high-wattage amplifiers to play at satisfying volumes. Zenith executives and engineers in Chicago recognized that the heavy console era was peaking and that modular component stereo systems were the unavoidable future. But they also knew the financial limits of their core demographic. The middle-class American buyer wanted serious stereo sound, but they did not want to spend a fortune on high-end audiophile receivers just to drive inefficient East Coast speakers. Zenith needed a standalone speaker system that could deliver massive, room-filling sound using the lower-powered, affordable solid-state amplifiers the company was already mass-producing. They needed a speaker that looked serious, sounded impressive on a showroom floor, and entirely bypassed the power-hungry demands of the elite audiophile market. By the early 1970s, Zenith's acoustic engineering laboratories were finalizing a design that would separate their sound from the heavy wooden consoles and put it directly onto the shelves of the American component stereo market. It was an engineering compromise, but it was a brilliantly executed one. They called it the Zenith Allegro. By 1973, the American audio landscape was fracturing. The massive, all-in-one wooden stereo console still commanded the center of the traditional living room. But a younger generation of listeners wanted something different. They wanted component audio. They wanted the flexibility of separate receivers, standalone turntables, and distinct pairs of speakers that could be moved, angled, and placed on bookshelves to create a proper stereo image. The illusion that sounds come from places between and around two speakers. The high-end audiophile market had already embraced the acoustic suspension speaker. Acoustic suspension, a sealed box design where the air inside the cabinet acts like a spring to control the woofer. Companies in New England were building brilliant sealed boxes, but these designs suffered from a severe mechanical limitation. They were notoriously power-hungry. To produce deep bass from a tightly sealed enclosure, they required massive, expensive high-wattage amplifiers. Zenith executives in Chicago recognized a massive gap in the market. The American middle class wanted the look and sound of professional component audio, but they could not afford to spend a month's salary on an elite stereo receiver just to drive inefficient speakers. Zenith needed to build a speaker, a device that turns an electrical audio signal into sound moving through air, that could deliver room-shaking volume and clear detail using the lower-powered, highly affordable solid-state amplifiers the company was already manufacturing. The engineering answer emerged from their Chicago laboratories under the name Zenith Allegro. To the American consumer walking into a showroom in the mid-1970s, the Zenith Allegro 3000 was a striking physical object. It was a heavy rectangular cabinet, the wooden, plastic, or composite box that holds the drivers and shapes how the speaker interacts with the air. It was finished in a rich, simulated walnut veneer, a thin layer of attractive wood or wood-like material used on the outside of a speaker cabinet. The front was covered by a sculpted, acoustically transparent cloth grille. But the true breakthrough lived behind that cloth. Zenith engineers utilized a meticulously calculated tuned port acoustic design. A port, an opening in a speaker cabinet that uses moving air to reinforce bass output. Instead of trapping the air inside a sealed box to restrict the driver, the moving part of a speaker that physically pushes air to create sound, the Allegro's cabinet allowed the back wave of sound generated inside the box to travel through a precisely measured plastic tube and exit out the front. This design drastically increased the speaker's efficiency, how loudly a speaker plays, from a given amount of amplifier power. By utilizing the tuned port, the Allegro's woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass and drums, could produce deep, resonant, low-end notes using a fraction of the electrical power required by an East Coast acoustic suspension design. For the high frequencies, Zenith engineers made another aggressive, highly efficient choice. Instead of a fragile paper cone, they installed a horn speaker, a speaker that uses a flared passage to make a driver more efficient and project sound into a room. This horn tweeter, a small driver designed to reproduce high frequencies such as cymbals, strings, and vocal detail, gave the Allegro a brilliant, forward, and highly dynamic top end. It was an acoustic profile perfectly suited for rock, jazz, and the heavily carpeted, drapery-filled acoustics of the 1970s American living room. The economic impact of this engineering was immediate. In 1974, a dedicated audiophile might spend over $800 to piece together a high-end system with inefficient speakers and a 100-watt receiver. In contrast, an American family could purchase an entire Zenith Allegro component system, including a pair of Allegro 3000 speakers, a solid-state AM/FM receiver, and an automatic turntable for roughly $300. At a time when the average American factory worker earned about $150 a week, Zenith had successfully democratized the component hi-fi experience. Zenith also possessed a commercial moat that no boutique audio company could ever replicate. They did not have to fight for shelf space in intimidating, dimly lit audiophile boutiques. Zenith simply pushed the Allegro line through their own massive, established national infrastructure. The Allegro system bypassed the audiophile gatekeepers entirely. It appeared in independent Zenith television dealerships across the American Midwest. It dominated the floor space in massive regional appliance showrooms like Polk Brothers in Chicago. It anchored the consumer electronics departments of major suburban retail chains. It was adopted by high school music classrooms that needed loud, clear playback on a strict public school budget. And it reached rural listeners through mainstream mail-order catalogs that had trusted the Zenith name for 50 years. Millions of Americans who had never read a high-end stereo magazine suddenly found themselves experiencing a true soundstage, the perceived width, depth, and placement of music created by a stereo system. They bought the Allegro because they trusted their local appliance dealer, but they kept it because the engineering was undeniably effective. It delivered high fidelity without the high anxiety of the audiophile world. The badge on the grille was not decoration. It was a promise about sound. By the late 1970s, Zenith was not merely a consumer electronics company, it was a sprawling American industrial empire. The sheer physical scale of their audio and television manufacturing dwarfed the boutique hi-fi brands of New England and the specialty horn builders of the West Coast. Zenith did not measure success in hundreds of speaker pairs sold to elite listeners. They measured it in millions of units shipped directly to the American middle class. This was the golden era of the integrated domestic supply chain. At its peak, Zenith employed tens of thousands of American workers across a vast network of facilities. The legendary Dickens Avenue plant in Chicago operated like a sovereign manufacturing city, processing raw materials into finished electronic chassis. The sprawling Plant No. 2 in Springfield, Missouri, assembled massive quantities of color televisions and stereo components. Zenith operated their own massive cabinet shops, where raw timber and high-quality wood veneer were cut, pressed, glued, and finished by union labor. They wound their own copper voice coils, a coil of wire attached to the speaker cone that moves when electricity passes through it. They assembled their own crossovers. They stamped their own metal chassis for the solid-state receivers that would drive the Allegro speaker line. The American listening ecosystem that supported this massive output was equally vast. Zenith did not wait for customers to seek out their products in intimidating, dimly lit audiophile showrooms. They met the American buyer where they already shopped and trusted the sales staff. Zenith speakers and stereo systems anchored the floor displays of massive regional appliance giants like Polk Brothers in Chicago. They filled the electronics departments of suburban department stores from the San Fernando Valley in California to Long Island, New York. They were the premier audio offering in thousands of independent, family-owned Zenith franchise dealerships that dotted the main streets of small-town America. They were ordered through mail-order catalogs by rural families in the Midwest who trusted the Zenith name above all others. Los Angeles built the high-efficiency theater horn. Cambridge argued for acoustic perfection. Baltimore sold performance to the budget-conscious listener. But Chicago, through Zenith, engineered the sound of the American mainstream. The Allegro speaker system was the absolute crown jewel of this retail strategy. Because the tuned port design was so highly efficient, Zenith could package a pair of Allegro 1000, 2000, or 3000 speakers with a modestly powered, highly reliable Zenith AM/FM stereo receiver and an automatic record changer, creating an entire instant hi-fi system in a single box. To a suburban family looking to upgrade from an old mono-table radio, this was a revelation. The Allegro system completely bypassed the intimidation factor of component audio. The buyer did not have to worry about impedance matching, the electrical load a speaker presents to an amplifier. They did not have to worry about whether their receiver had enough current to control a heavy, sealed acoustic suspension woofer. They simply carried the heavy wooden boxes into their living room, plugged the Allegro speakers into the back of the Zenith receiver, dropped a needle on a record, and experienced immediate, room-filling stereo sound. For nearly a decade, the Zenith Allegro was arguably one of the most widely heard stereo speakers in the United States. It was the system playing classic rock in a Midwestern college dorm room. It was the stereo projecting the evening news, or a jazz record in a wood-paneled basement in New Jersey. It was the centerpiece of the living room in a newly built suburban home in Texas. Zenith had successfully bridged the gap between the heavy, immovable wooden consoles of the 1960s and the modern, flexible component audio systems of the 1970s. and they had done it while keeping the engineering, the manufacturing, and the assembly strictly within the borders of the United States. The corporate motto, "The quality goes in before the name goes on," was not just a marketing slogan during this era, it was an operational reality, backed by thousands of factory jobs, a sprawling national dealer network, and millions of satisfied American listeners. The cultural penetration of the Zenith Allegro in the 1970s was absolute. It was not a niche product debated in high-end audio magazines. It was a fixture of the American suburban experience. To understand its scale, one must look at the specific American listening rooms it occupied. It sat on deep pile carpets in New Jersey basements. It rested on heavy wooden bookshelves in Ohio split-level homes. It flanked Zenith televisions in California dens. In a heavily draped American living room, where two cheap imported boxes could make a rock album sound flat, harsh, and distant, a pair of Zenith Allegros could make a bass guitar feel physically present, projecting a soundstage wide enough to convince a listener they were sitting in the front row of a concert hall. The tuned port cabinet design delivered a uniquely warm frequency response, how evenly a speaker reproduces low, middle, and high sounds that perfectly flattered the pop, soul, and rock records of the decade. The horn tweeter pushed vocal detail through the room with striking clarity, ensuring that the listener did not need to sit in one perfect chair to hear the music. Zenith understood that they were not just selling a pair of speakers, they were selling an integrated entertainment ecosystem. A consumer could buy a Zenith color television, a matching Zenith stereo receiver, and a pair of Zenith Allegro speakers, creating a unified wall of American-made electronics. The visual and acoustic impact was a statement of middle-class stability. The badge on the speaker grill signaled that the family had invested in quality, backed by a local dealer who would service the equipment if a dial ever snapped or a driver failed. This consumer trust translated into staggering corporate metrics. At its manufacturing peak in the middle of the decade, the Zenith Radio Corporation was a titan of domestic labor. The company employed over 25,000 American workers across its various divisions. The Dickens Avenue headquarters in Chicago directed a manufacturing network that included sprawling component plants in Melrose Park, massive final assembly lines in Springfield, Missouri, and dedicated cabinet shops operating across the Midwest. They were producing millions of consumer electronic devices every single year. The Allegro line itself expanded rapidly to capture every possible buyer. Zenith introduced the compact Allegro 1000 for tight bedroom shelves, the mainstream Allegro 2000 and 3000 for typical living rooms, and the massive Allegro 4000 series, which featured larger woofers and a complex mid-frequency horn to fill the largest suburban basements. They packaged these speakers into modular wedge systems, sleek, angled, all-in-one stereo receivers featuring built-in 8-track tape players and automatic record changers. These highly affordable packages quickly became standard equipment in countless American college dormitories. For a brief, glorious window in the 1970s, Zenith successfully defended the American living room from the specialized, high-priced hi-fi boutiques on one side, and the rising tide of cheap, imported electronics on the other. They proved that an American company, utilizing domestic manufacturing and internal engineering, could mass-produce a serious, high-fidelity stereo speaker that middle-class families could actually afford. To walk into an independent Zenith showroom during this era was to witness the peak of American consumer electronics confidence. The local salesman knew the product. The factory was a few states away, not across an ocean. The heavy wooden cabinet felt permanent. The tuned port pushed a physical wave of bass into the chest. The listener believed that as long as they owned a Zenith, the music would remain loud, clear, and firmly rooted in American soil. But that confidence was an illusion. The structural forces that would dismantle the Zenith audio empire were already gathering speed. driven by the ruthless mathematics of global trade, shifting retail channels, and the increasingly impossible cost of paying an American worker to build a wooden box. The Zenith audio empire did not collapse overnight. It was dismantled piece by piece by a relentless convergence of structural market forces that made its massive domestic manufacturing infrastructure mathematically impossible to sustain. The American turning point arrived at the dawn of the 1980s. For decades, Zenith had successfully insulated itself against specialized audiophile companies by dominating the middle-class living room with trusted, reliable sound. But the executives in Chicago were entirely unprepared for the invasion of the global electronics giants and the fundamental rewriting of American retail. The first devastating blow was the arrival of cheaper, highly advanced imports. A massive wave of high-fidelity equipment from Japan crashed into the American audio market. Brands like Pioneer, Sansui, Kenwood, Sony, and Technics did not just introduce cheaper products, they completely redefined what the American consumer expected a stereo system to look, feel, and sound like. The Japanese component systems featured sleek, brushed aluminum faceplates, precision-weighted tuning dials, and illuminated LED volume meters. They looked like sophisticated professional laboratory instruments. Next to these modern silver-faced receivers, Zenith's integrated plastic systems and heavy wood-grain speaker cabinets suddenly looked like outdated furniture from a bygone decade. Simultaneously, the American listening culture experienced a profound shift. For half a century, the Zenith radio or stereo console had been the communal focal point of the American living room. Families gathered around it. But as the 1980s progressed, audio became increasingly individualized and decentralized. The personal cassette player arrived. Portable boomboxes took music out of the house. The living room was no longer the sole sacred domain of the heavy wooden speaker. The American buyer still wanted music at home, but they wanted it from smaller, sleeker, and less obtrusive equipment. These shifting tastes immediately exposed Zenith's greatest vulnerability. The company's massive, vertically integrated American supply chain, once its greatest historical advantage, rapidly became a fatal liability. American speakers required cabinets, veneers, drivers, magnets, voice coils, cones, surrounds, crossovers, testing, packaging, shipping, and skilled labor. To build a Zenith Allegro speaker, the company had to pay unionized American workers in Illinois and Missouri to cut the wood, wind the copper, assemble the components, and construct the heavy enclosures. Meanwhile, overseas competitors were utilizing highly optimized global supply chains, highly automated assembly lines, and significantly lower labor costs. An American-made wooden speaker cabinet simply cost too much to build, pack, and transport across the interstate highway system. The financial math of domestic audio manufacturing was breaking. As wood, labor, magnets, shipping, and domestic production became more expensive, Zenith discovered a brutal truth. A beautiful cabinet and an honest driver could cost more than the mass market was willing to pay. Compounding this manufacturing crisis was the absolute collapse of Zenith's traditional sales channels. For over 50 years, Zenith had relied on a trusted network of independent, family-owned appliance stores and franchise television repair shops. But the American middle-class buyer was changing their habits. They stopped driving to the local mom-and-pop Zenith dealer on Main Street. Instead, they drove out to the newly built big-box electronics stores, discount retail warehouses, and sprawling mall chains like Circuit City and early Best Buy locations. In these high-volume, warehouse-style environments, there was no loyal neighborhood salesman to carefully demonstrate the acoustic superiority of the Zenith Allegro's tuned port design. The Zenith speaker was simply hauled out of a cardboard shipping box, placed on a crowded, fluorescent-lit metal shelf alongside dozens of cheaper imported brands, and subjected to a ruthless, side-by-side price war. A speaker did not only have to sound good, it had to survive the room where it was sold. And on the discount retail shelf, the sticker price was the only metric that mattered to the casual buyer. To survive this brutal new reality, Zenith executives initiated a desperate, systematic retreat. The company began to abandon the very engineering practices that had justified their famous motto. First, they stopped building the massive, room-filling wooden stereo consoles. The American living room no longer had the space, and the company could no longer afford the freight costs to ship them. Next, the uncompromising quality of the Allegro speaker line was targeted for aggressive cost-cutting. As the price pressure from imports intensified, the manufacturing compromises became glaringly obvious to anyone who opened a cabinet. The rich, heavy, simulated walnut veneer on the exterior was replaced by thinner, cheaper vinyl wraps that easily peeled, bubbled, and scratched at the corners. The dense, acoustically inert wood of the speaker boxes was swapped for low-grade particle board, a manufactured wood product made from compressed wood chips and resin, used as a cheaper, lighter alternative to solid timber. The complex internal crossovers were simplified to save pennies on the assembly line, stripping away the precise frequency separation that had once made the Allegro sound so balanced. The heavy cast metal frames holding the woofers were replaced by thin stamped steel that resonated under heavy bass. The high-efficiency horn tweeters were swapped for cheaper, mass-produced paper cones. The Zenith Allegro, once a legitimately impressive piece of middle-class acoustic engineering, was slowly hollowed out from the inside. The famous lightning bolt badge remained on the grille cloth, but the speaker behind it was fundamentally altered. Zenith was no longer dictating the standard of American sound. They were desperately chasing the lowest possible retail price point just to keep their assembly lines moving. The financial hemorrhage at Zenith Radio Corporation accelerated aggressively throughout the late 1980s. The company was fighting a devastating multi-front war. Their core television division was trapped in an unwinnable price battle with imported screens, entirely draining the massive capital reserves required to innovate in their audio divisions. To survive, corporate leadership made the brutal calculation that domestic audio manufacturing was an unsustainable luxury. The retreat from American soil was systematic, absolute, and tragic. Zenith executives began dismantling the immense, vertically integrated supply chain that had defined the company for half a century. For decades, the legendary Dickens Avenue plant in Chicago had stood as a towering industrial fortress, a sprawling, multi-story mansion of glass, steel, and brick where raw ambition, copper wire, and timber were alchemy spun into acoustic gold. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem humming with thousands of inhabitants who took fierce, almost mythical pride in their craft. But the cost of this domestic labor and domestic timber could no longer be justified for a product destined for the discount shelf of a big-box retailer. The sprawling cabinet shops, where unionized American workers had once pressed real wood veneer and assembled dense, heavy acoustic enclosures, were among the first to be liquidated. Production of the remaining audio components was rapidly moved across the border into facilities in Mexico, and increasingly, outsourced entirely to third-party manufacturers in Taiwan and mainland China. As the manufacturing geography shifted, the physical product suffered from severe brand dilution, the weakening of a brand when its name appears on products that no longer match the original quality or identity. The Zenith Allegro name, which had spent the 1970s representing a mathematically precise tuned port design and a high-efficiency horn tweeter, was now being licensed and stamped onto entirely generic, lightweight plastic speaker boxes. These new imported systems were bundled with cheap, all-in-one stereo units designed exclusively for massive chain stores. The heavy cast metal driver frames were gone. The complex internal crossovers were replaced by single microscopic capacitors. The heavy-duty speaker terminals were replaced by fragile spring clips that barely held a thin wire. The local American hi-fi dealer could no longer defend the product because the local dealer no longer existed. The mom-and-pop appliance stores and neighborhood television showrooms that had built Zenith's reputation for reliability had been systematically driven into bankruptcy by the rise of national warehouse electronics chains. Zenith was forced to compete in these massive, fluorescent-lit aisles where there were no listening rooms, no demonstrations, and no brand loyalty. A consumer walking into a Best Buy or Circuit City in 1990 did not view Zenith as a premium American audio brand. They viewed it as a legacy name, priced at the absolute bottom of the market, sitting beside dozens of identical, inexpensive imports. By the early 1990s, the American listening culture experienced another massive technological and retail shift. The traditional two-channel stereo system was rapidly losing ground to home theater. The integration of multi-channel surround sound with television video playback. Consumers were buying 5 smaller speakers and a subwoofer, a speaker designed to reproduce very low bass frequencies, to recreate the cinema experience in their basements. Zenith, financially exhausted and stripped of its acoustic engineering talent, simply could not pivot to dominate this new era. They attempted to package cheap surround sound bundles, but they were entirely outclassed by dedicated audio companies and outpriced by massive Asian conglomerates. The final American chapter was inevitable. The company that had once proudly declared, "The quality goes in before the name goes on," was suffocating under a mountain of corporate debt. In 1995, Zenith Electronics surrendered its independence. The company sold a controlling 57% stake to LG Electronics, a massive South Korean industrial conglomerate. The last standing American television and home audio manufacturer was quietly absorbed into a global portfolio. The acquisition marked the formal end of Zenith's American manufacturing empire. The remaining domestic facilities were systematically shut down. The Dickens Avenue plant in Chicago, once a vibrant, humming city of American electronics assembly, was permanently abandoned. The thousands of inhabitants who had spent their lives winding voice coils, cutting wood, and testing circuits were dismissed into a changing economy. The engineering laboratories that had designed the original tuned port Allegro systems were emptied. The dealer network was gone. The catalogs were memory. The American market had made its final ruling. It praised fidelity, but it purchased convenience. It loved the idea of a heavy wooden cabinet built in Chicago, but it opened its wallet for a lightweight plastic box shipped across the Pacific. The Zenith audio empire did not fall because of a single bad speaker. It fell because the American listening room it was designed to serve no longer existed. The transition was absolute. The Chicago factory closed. The assembly line stopped. The cabinet shops vanished. The local dealers collapsed. The big box shelves won. The heavy wood disappeared. The plastic imports took over. The stereo rack emptied. The soundbar arrived. The lightning badge lost meaning. The living room moved on. The American speaker went quiet. Zenith did not experience a glorious American hi-fi resurrection. When LG Electronics finalized its acquisition in the late 1990s, they did not buy Zenith to save its audio heritage. They bought it to absorb its high-definition television patents and its established American distribution network. The Zenith name survived, but it was fundamentally hollowed out. In the 21st century, the famous lightning bolt logo was largely relegated to budget flat-screen televisions, DVD players, and digital converter boxes sold in the aisles of discount retailers. It became a brand associated with budget hotel rooms and hospital waiting areas, not premium living room audio. The massive acoustic engineering division that had designed the tuned port Allegro systems was permanently dissolved. The Zenith speaker, as an American-made, meticulously engineered acoustic instrument, simply ceased to exist. The market had swallowed the name and discarded the sound. Yet the physical objects stubbornly refused to disappear. Across the United States today, a vibrant and dedicated vintage audio community keeps the Zenith Allegro alive. The massive production runs of the 1970s ensured that thousands of these speakers survived the decades, hiding in Midwestern basements, California thrift stores, and East Coast estate sales. On forums like Audio Karma, in Reddit vintage audio communities, and across YouTube restoration channels, younger listeners and veteran technicians are rediscovering these heavy, ported wooden boxes. They rescue them from Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. They place them on repair benches to perform essential maintenance. They practice refoaming, replacing a deteriorated foam surround on a woofer to allow the cone to move in and out correctly again. They engage in recapping, replacing old capacitors in a crossover to restore or stabilize speaker performance, ensuring the high frequencies reach the horn tweeter with absolute clarity. The people saving these speakers are not elite, wealthy audiophiles chasing perfection. They are everyday listeners, musicians, and audio mechanics who respect the honest, heavy engineering of a bygone era. They do not buy and restore these Zenith speakers out of blind nostalgia. They buy them because the core acoustic engineering remains undeniably effective. An old American speaker with a solid wooden cabinet, a repaired woofer, and a crossover restored by careful hands can still do what a modern, plastic wireless box often cannot: make a recording feel physically anchored in the room. Modern portable audio relies heavily on digital signal processing to trick the human ear into hearing bass from tiny cylinders. The Zenith Allegro relied on the immutable laws of physics. It used a massive wooden box, a precisely measured port, and the physical movement of air to produce deep, resonant low frequencies. The high-efficiency design still allows a cheap, low-wattage vintage receiver to produce a massive, room-filling soundstage. But the physical American geography that birthed that sound is gone. If you drive to the corner of Dickens and Austin Avenues in Chicago today, looking for the towering industrial fortress that once built these sound systems, you will not find it. The massive Zenith Radio Corporation Plant Number 1, once humming with thousands of unionized American workers, was entirely demolished. The site was leveled and redeveloped into a sprawling brick shopping center, anchored by a massive Home Depot and a large grocery store. The ground where American hands once wound copper voice coils, cut real walnut veneer, and tested stereo receivers is now a quiet, sprawling asphalt parking lot. There is, however, a strange, quiet footnote to the Zenith audio story. Because the company built their products with such an over-engineered obsession with durability, the individual components often outlive the cabinets themselves. Today, you can frequently find Zenith Allegro high-efficiency horn tweeters carefully extracted from broken enclosures and reused by modern DIY acoustic engineers. These modern builders incorporate the old Zenith horns into custom high-end speaker designs because the vocal clarity and efficiency of the original 1970s American manufacturing remains incredibly difficult to replicate at a low cost today. The parts outlasted the empire. The story of Zenith in America is the story of how the country changed the way it values sound. It reveals a profound, irreconcilable gap between what American listeners claim to respect: craftsmanship, repairability, honest engineering, and high fidelity, and what the retail market actually rewards: absolute convenience, compact size, wireless portability, and the lowest possible price. Zenith built a speaker system designed to last a lifetime, using domestic labor and heavy materials, in a consumer market that was rapidly deciding that electronics should be disposable. Yet despite the factory closures and the shifting retail landscape, the original promise has not entirely vanished. Somewhere today, a Zenith Allegro is still sitting in the corner of a quiet American living room, its wood grain catching the afternoon light, waiting for a silver receiver, a heavy record, and one more song. See you in the next one.